Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Velo WX wash processed Panama from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this coffee was featured in a recent blind taste test rankings video where it finished first place out of 8 Coffea Circulor coffees on that day. And that wasn't too much of a surprise given that this coffee was the one most in line with my own preferences and the coffee that was the biggest catalyst for this entire Coffea Circulor purchase to begin with. That being said, it's always interesting to see if the first place finisher does maintain its status as our favorite of the coffees that we tried. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 48. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this one is also in line with our recent run of Coffea Circulor coffees, which we've continued to describe as being on the moderately light side of things, as this one was definitely true to that as well. Don't think there's too much need for elaboration on that, so for that reason we will go ahead and say that this one does skew on the moderately light side by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and that of course was the blind taste test day. And this coffee stood out mostly because of the way that it did cool down, offering a sweeter presentation of the listed stone fruit qualities to it. But outside of that, it was a little bit generic in the citric and floral sense, as there wasn't too much to take away from this initial impression, given that it was competing against a number of other heavily processed coffees on that table. And there was only one other true wash processed coffee to compete against, so it wasn't too surprising that it finished first place, and if anything, I didn't necessarily feel like it stood out as much as I was hoping this coffee was going to stand out. Day 18 through the Chemex, and the coffee was still a little bit more tame than expected, expectedly clean with a mostly citric fruit forward experience, but nothing overly pronounced yet, as I honestly just felt like this coffee needed a little bit more time, as there wasn't anything that really stood out about this coffee on the second impression either. Day 21 through the UFO Brewer, and it continues to feel like the best of this coffee is yet to come, as it continues to offer a more generic feel in a slightly geisha-like sense, something I'll elaborate on a little bit throughout this review, but also a little bit generic in the citric qualities, as it does offer a little bit of the listed orange characteristic, but outside of that, it is a little bit more reminiscent of the listed brown sugar characteristic, as it did have a long-lasting sugary quality to it, which we'll also get into a little bit more throughout this review. Outside of that though, pretty delicate and tame, but clean, not necessarily to the level that we might have expected for it being a wash Panamanian geisha. Day 24 through the V60 with Coffea Circulor's recipe, and the coffee is surprisingly the least impressive it had been to this point, as it's a little bit brighter and a little bit less defined than it had been up to this point. A little less cleanliness as well, as there's a slight bit of harshness, as it's possible that we did over extract this coffee, which in itself is kind of strange given that the recipe is a lower extraction one, so not entirely sure what happened on this day, but we'll go ahead and move on to day 27 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments. And this was one of the better days that we had experienced of this coffee, as it was the cleanest it had been to this point. And this will make for a kind of interesting discussion, as the coffee offered a Mejorado level of cleanliness as opposed to a true geisha level of cleanliness, as it does have more of that listed brown sugar characteristic to it and a more pronounced peachiness as well. And what makes that so interesting is that I feel like if you would have placed this coffee alongside a number of the other Mejorado coffees that we had reviewed this year, so I'm thinking specifically of a lot of the ones that we had from, say, in the past, I could say, or I could see them all being the same varietal given just the way this coffee did present itself. So it was clean, but not geisha clean. And it was sweet, but it was a little bit more sugary Mejorado sweet as opposed to Panamanian geisha sweet. It did offer florals and fruit qualities, but at the same time, they presented the way they do a little bit more in Mejorado coffees than they do in geisha coffees. So truth be told, it was just a little bit of a strange experience, given we review so many Mejorado coffees, probably a little bit more Mejorado than we do geisha overall, so having this one translate a little bit more in line with that varietal was pretty unique as of this moment. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point, offering more intensity to the stone fruit scents, but it does continue to remain a little bit more intense and delicate than you might expect for a geisha, as there's an abundance of sugariness yet again. So that continues to be in line with my experiences, as on day 36 we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's still not quite as tame and delicate as you might expect, with a little bit more of a sweet citric forward experience and plenty of the sugariness to follow once again. And that's such a big takeaway. When it comes to Panamanian geishas, I fully expect them, especially washed ones, to be pretty tame, pretty delicate, the base to be super clean, and as a result you will feel a lot of the characteristics in a very well defined and pronounced sense, if maybe not necessarily the most intense sense. But for this coffee, it took shades off those things, so it wasn't the cleanest, but as a trade-off it was a little bit more intense, it was a little bit more sweet, it was a little bit more sugary, and the fruit qualities didn't present in that super clean base sense where they just became super transparent, as opposed to being this coffee having a little bit more intensity and those fruit and floral characteristics being just a little bit more intense overall. On day 42, final notes, we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was back to being at its very best, though once again it is a lot more reminiscent of Mejorado coffees, as it feels very clean with a softness but plenty of intensity in a more sugary sense. I can say that it felt a little bit more apple-like this time around as well, and that's something that I often associate with Mejorado coffees. Plenty of a honeyed florality and a lingering honey sweetness to the finish as well, with plenty of those sugary qualities. So yeah, if I didn't know better, I could say that this coffee was reminiscent of so many of the Mejorado coffees that we have reviewed over the last couple of years as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We will actually start with the finish level 4. Finish is just very sugary, and as I continue to harp on it, it's just reminded me a lot of the way that Mejorado coffees finish, especially given that it's honeyed, it's sugary, and those are two things that I describe so often when it comes to Mejorado coffee. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Sweetness level 4, interestingly, one of the sweeter coffees that we are reviewing from Coffea Circulor this time around. There's definitely one that was significantly sweeter than this coffee, but the experience we had with this one was very sugary, and they have that brown sugar note list on there. Makes a lot of sense given the experience that we did have for this coffee. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Florality level 4, I mentioned the honeyed florality being the most abundant characteristic, and that in itself is strange. It's a Panamanian geisha. I'm really hoping for a lot of those jasmine characteristics to this one, but I really could not see any of the white floral qualities to it. In fact, I don't think that they have any floral notes listed on here, which in itself is a little bit of a surprise, and it should have been a slight bit of a red flag when going into this one. But just like with the Velo NX, I was fully planning on purchasing this coffee regardless of what sort of descriptions they put on it. Let's go ahead and move on to the citrus fruit level 4. I do believe they have an orange note listed on here, and it did not present in that citric grain quality that I usually get from a lot of washed Panamanian geishas, and even ones I've had from Coffea Circulor in the past. So I don't really know what to make of that. The citric qualities that were presented within this one are very reminiscent of what I get from Mejorado coffees. Same thing with the stone fruit being there at the level 4. And I do believe they have a peach note listed on here as well, and I can definitely see that. But again, it's intense as opposed to soft and delicate in its presentation. So level 4, where we opted to put that. When I say intense, I say washed level of intense, not natural level of intense. Let's go and move on to the level 3s real quick. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Also been pretty consistent with all of the coffees we've discussed from Coffea Circulor up to this point, as it wasn't the brightest coffee. Didn't expect it to be the brightest coffee. A little bit of some, interestingly, palm fruit brightness. A little bit of that apple-like characteristic to it in that regard. A caramel level 3. That's that brown sugar note, that brown sugar quality and characteristic that we get so often from Mejorado coffees in general, and you can see that played a pretty significant role in this coffee. Two more things worth discussing. We'll start with the body level 2, lighter bodied cup of coffee. Same thing with Mejorado, as we say that they fluctuate in the acidity between a 3 and the 4, and the body between a 2 and a 3, and that seemed to be the case with this coffee. Even then, it just had a little bit more texture to it where it wasn't truly tea-like, and for that reason we bumped it up. And then the final thing we're discussing, and the most important thing we're discussing, the cleanliness level 4. We say we look for minimum level 4 cleanliness for all of our coffees, but when it comes to Panamanian geishas, washed Panamanian geishas, the goal for those is level 5. And anything below a level 5 is a little bit of a letdown, and that was the case with this coffee. The notes in here are very transparent, they're very well defined. It didn't take too much to pick out all the qualities within this coffee. They're pretty well represented, but washed Panamanian geishas are just on a different level. Even washed Ethiopian geishas at times can be on a different level than what we experienced from this coffee, and it didn't have that just very unbelievably clean, super clean base to it that I was expecting for it, and for that reason it was really hard to bump it up higher than that level 4. Truth be told, it never had potential to reach above that level 4 mark, so that's where we had to put it. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one had some sky-high expectations, and it's safe to say that it didn't live up to those because, once again, it's a Hacienda La Esmeralda coffee and it is from Coffea Circulor. So, in theory, on paper, the combination of the two should make for one of my favorite coffees for the entire year. And this one at least was washed as well, so that just added to that. And even though this coffee acted like one of my favorite varietals out there, like a Mejorado, it's still a geisha coffee, and at the end of the day, I do prefer geishas to act like geishas, and it's not a win that a coffee acted like something that I would usually enjoy, especially when I have higher expectations for it, and I do want better from this sort of coffee. I don't really know what to make of the way that this coffee did turn out because it's so unusual. I've never had a geisha be this Mejorado-like. I've had Mejorados that can be slightly geisha-like, largely because they're too tame and too soft, but this one, pulling a little bit of a reverse card, having been a little bit more intense, was definitely not what I was expecting for it. And I think at the end of the day, it didn't make for what I was really hoping for this coffee to turn out to be. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed it. I mean, a coffee acting like a Mejorado is going to be one that I'm always going to enjoy. A coffee that's sweeter, a coffee that's more floral, fruit forward, and intense with all of those characteristics is going to be something that I'm going to enjoy. But I really wanted that level 5 cleanliness. I really wanted that level 5 florality, and this one never really had potential of reaching either of those two characteristics. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I don't know how to say. If you've always wanted a geisha coffee to taste like a Mejorado, then maybe this one's a good fit. It has a lot of sugariness to it. It has a lot of sweetness to it. It has a fair bit of intensity for a Panamanian geisha, while at the same time still offering that lighter body to it. I mean, the tasting wheel that we put up is very reminiscent of so many other Mejorado coffees that we have reviewed in the past. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear any thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the Velo WX Wash Process Panama from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.